Hello, Year 10. Welcome to this week's episode of your English Literature podcast. We are talking to you today about the poem Mother Any Distance by Simon Armitage. Take a moment now to pause this podcast. Make sure, please, that you have a copy of the poem in front of you. Read through the poem before you start the podcast again. Pause the podcast now. Okay, good. So with you today you have Miss Beaumont.
Mr. Rafi, Mr. Almond.
And we're going to start today just by talking a little bit overall about a quick summary of the poem, what we think this poem's about. Anyone want to start us off?
Well, right from the offset, we understand that this is a poem about growing up. We can understand that the speaker is someone who's moving on with their life, moving forward with their life. Perhaps they've bought a house and they're trying to move into that house. They need the mother's help to help them settle in, but essentially this is a step away from the mother herself, so it's pushing forward towards independence.
Definitely. So already we've read quite a few poems in the anthology that are about similar ideas and similar themes. You know, we've just read Walking Away recently, which is obviously about a parent's experience of their child growing up. We've read the poem Follower as well, which is a child's perspective of their parent as they grow up. And here we've got another child's perspective of their parent, but this time it's the situation is moving out of the house and taking that step away from the family home and into your own home, which is like a big step of independence, I suppose, isn't it? So we'll give you a little bit of context about Simon Armitage. There's perhaps not as much context that's directly relevant to this poem as there is to some others. But what we do know is that Simon Armitage wrote this poem for a collection of poems called Book of Matches. And these were all poems that were designed to be read in a very short length of time. So when you strike a match, as you may know, it burns down, and within about 20-30 seconds it burns away into nothing. And all of the poems in Simon Armitage's collection were all designed to be very short poems that could be read in that length of time. Simon Armitage is a poet laureate, so that means he is the highest regarded poet in the whole of the UK. He's been appointed by the Queen herself to be the nation's poet. So he's a very, very famous poet. And what he tends to write about are very relatable subjects. So things that perhaps we've all experienced. Family, relationships within family, things like that. So let's have a little look deeper now at the language of the poem and some of the techniques that have been used. Would anyone like to comment on anything that stood out to them?
Yeah, you definitely get a sense of a direct link to the domestic sphere. So I found a semantic field of the domestic sphere in the sense that you've got windows, doors, floors, a second pair of hands, bedrooms. So it's quite oriented in essence in the stereotypical view of a housewife, the domestic attitude at home. These are all sort of objects that you normally associate with a housewife. So generally speaking, a housewife has connotations of nurturing, of being dependable, for growing up a child into an adult. So a lot of memories and a lot of experiences and a lot of growth take place in a home, and typically it would be a housewife to encourage that. But what's quite ironic with this poem is, as this poem progresses, we kind of see an ironic take in which, in essence, the role of a housewife is to nurture her child and then let the child go into the world, where we see later on that I don't think she finds it quite as easy to let go of that process.
Yeah, I think one of the things I find really interesting about this poem is I can remember when I first moved out, it was really exciting when I moved to university, which is the first time I lived away from home. It was really exciting, but it's also quite a daunting experience. That first time that you realise that you're in your own place and you don't really have anyone to turn to if something goes wrong, that can be quite an overwhelming experience. And a lot of the language that Armitage uses kind of reflects that perhaps sense of fear or anxiety. So if you look at on the first stanza at the last line, he describes the acres of the walls and the prairies of the floors. Now, an acre is a big area of land, and a prairie is a huge area of wild land. So he's using this very hyperbolic language, this aedonatum, this extreme hyperbole, to emphasize how big and empty this space surrounding him seems to be, which perhaps reflects the speaker's perhaps nervousness or anxiety at his mother perhaps being about to step away from him. What about speaking of sort of this idea of space and distance, what do we make about this image of the spool of tape in the second stanza? So we've got you at the zero end, me with the spool of tape, recording length, reporting meters, centimeters back to base.
We get the symbolism of attachment linking to the umbilical cord when obviously you're born. And the symbolism surrounding that, the mother is finding it very difficult to let go and keeps attached to her son. So this spool of tape, and there's a few different references to this sort of attachment. She's holding on. Later on we see that he feels her fingertips and the pinch, even though it's a tiny little pinch, he still feels that she's there. So that attachment and that sort of proximity that she's always there sort of stays throughout.
So we've almost got something physical in the poem symbolising that emotional connection that a parent has with their child. And that's really nicely reflected in the image of the anchor and the kite, isn't it? They're also two objects that have, they've got a string and something at the end of them. Obviously, they're opposites as well, though. An anchor is something that keeps you firm on the ground, whereas a kite is something that flies up into the air. So I find that another thing that's quite interesting about poems is there's lots of excitement and imagery of kind of reaching up and becoming more, but there's also quite a lot of imagery that suggests that there is a possibility of being held down, or perhaps even a sense of failure as well.
Yeah, that sense of failure, or perhaps reaching for success, you can see very clearly in the last couple of lines. I reach towards a house that opens under an endless sky to fall or fly. So he's happy and excited, like we said, to go on his own journey of independence and just see whether he can make it. So he needs to go and be by himself and do what he wants to do, and then find out if he's able to fall or fly.
And you can see in that stanza as well just how reluctant his mum is of letting him do that, because her fingers, it says your fingers still pinch the last 100th of an inch, which is an old-fashioned measurement, but it's a millimetre. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny amount. So it's like her fingers are at the end of this rope, and she doesn't want to let go. Again, which is something we've seen before in poems. We've seen this idea of walking away. We've seen this idea that parents struggle with that idea of letting their children become fully fledged adults.
Yeah, the idea is quite prevalent, especially with the use of ellipses just after that quote. You can really see the physical separation between the two sentences, but also the metaphorical separation of he's now, as said earlier on, decided that he's going to take this step further into independence, that he's excited about the prospect of being independent, but you do generally get that niggling sensation that someone is still holding on. And I think he's at this stage of the poem, in the last few lines, he's really decided that he's going to break free.
Yeah, I really like that image of the spacewalking at the start of that last stanza as well. I spacewalk through the empty bedrooms, because it makes me think of when astronauts are out in space, and again, space really reflects that idea of a huge empty expanse of nothingness, just like those prairies and those acres of the walls. If an astronaut has to repair something on a spaceship, they have to attach themselves to the ship and go out into that expanse. So it's a really lovely metaphor that I think really highlights that sense of anxiety and apprehension perhaps that he's feeling. So if we were going to think, because we don't have a lot of context about the poet themselves, it would be a really good idea to sort of bring in some critics perhaps to boost our understanding of context or our interpretations in the exam. So what kinds of critics might be good fits for interpretations of this poem?
Well, one of the most obvious ones, if you look at Plato's Ladder of Love, is family love, which is storge. So you can clearly see that that's the type of love that's being presented in this poem. So you can explore how that's being presented.
Yeah, also following on from that, you can also see John Locke's theory of the tabula rasa, in essence that everyone is this unshapen ball of clay, and it's society that shapes and molds a person into who they are. And you can get this sense, going back to the second stanza where it mentions spool of tape, recording length, recording meters, centimeters, can represent different stages in his life where he's reporting maybe less to the mothers, where when he's young, he might be full of excitement of this is happening in my life, and then obviously as he gets older, the reporting gets less and less. And I feel like he gets this sense, the narrator, that the only way that he's going to form, the only way he's going to make his own clay, he wants himself to define him. He doesn't want society. Maybe society can be the shadow of the mother and the involvement that's stopping him from growing. And the only way for him to make his own ball of clay, his own identity, is to make his own journey.
I think you could probably link that to the overall form of the poem as well, because that idea that you just talked about of breaking free of convention and what perhaps parents or authority figures in your life expect of you. We look at the poem, it's written in quite a loose structure. We've got some internal rhyme, but no regular rhyme or rhythm throughout. And in fact, it grows more irregular throughout the poem. So that could perhaps reflect this idea that the young speaker in the poem wants to break away from the rigid confines of being child. Because when you're a child, people do tell you what to do, and you've got a very structured life. You have to go to school and you have to do as your parents tell you. Whereas as you get older, a lot more of those choices become your responsibility. So we've already kind of touched on some of the themes that we could make links to in this poem. We've obviously got the theme of distance with those measurements. We've got the theme of family as well. Anything else?
Yeah, most definitely independence as well. Just touching early on distance, I think it's quite important to look at the use of anaphora in the first sentence of the stanza, repeating the same beginning of the sentence. Mother, any distance, but the use of the comma, that little break, can also signify that he still considers his mother at the value of the mother, even no matter how far he's gone into life. So in essence, he really wants the independence, and he can only get that if the mother decides to let him have that independence. And that clearly links to growing up as well. So it's quite a prevalent theme of letting someone nurture, of letting someone go into the world. And the only way that this narrator feels like he can have that independence and that theme of growing up is by creating this metaphorical and physical distance.
Yeah, definitely. And that also links to this idea of rejection as well that we've seen in lots of the poems. We've seen lots of romantic rejection predominantly, but this is family rejection. This is the rejection, not completely, but a child wanting to break free of their parents and some of the confines of that parent and child relationship. So if we were going to link this to poems, what would be some obvious contenders for poems that would make strong links to this one?
The first thing I think of is follower. Just the changing relationship of the parent and the child, especially as they grow up, and the sort of ungrateful nature of the child towards the latter end of the stage of where the relationship gets to. So in Father, we see at the end he feels like his dad is a nuisance, and he's sick of him following him around. In this one, he's just aching to break free and move away, even though the mother's been there every step of the way and she's just there to support him. He still wants to reach away and move away.
Yeah, definitely. I know I've mentioned it a couple of times so far. I always think walking away is a really, really strong contender as well, particularly with all the metaphors in there about this idea of parents being worried about their children growing up, the half-fledged thing the seed spinning away, all would link really nicely with, I think, the metaphors of distance that are within this poem as well. Anything else before we finish?
Yeah, just touching upon the point they just made now, but you definitely do get a sense of two different parental styles. Even though we're not explicitly told how the mother brought up the narrator in the poem, we do get the sense in walking away that the parent does feel that sense of hesitation, but ultimately decides that his love, or the parental love, is shown through letting the child go. And I feel like that love is maybe tainted in this poem, because Simon Armitage clearly or shows within the poem that there's that almost not jubilation but happiness, that there's a separation between the parents, which shouldn't really be the case.
Yeah, I wonder if that's just a note that it's the speaker in this poem is the child rather than the parent, and it just illustrates how different those experiences can be. I mean, I guess as a parent, you're probably more likely to have those worries and those concerns for your child rather than the other way around. But that's a really nice point to make. So we hope that's been helpful for you, Year 10. And don't forget to tune in next week for your next podcast. But for now, goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.